Zoe Porphyrogenita, Empress 1028 to 1050. The second of Constantine VIII's three daughters, Zoe served as the face of the Macedonian Dynasty once her father and uncle passed away. Growing up without any cousins or brothers, Zoe fully expected that she would get married and be the mother of a future ruler. Far and away the most attractive of Constantine's daughters, Zoe was engaged to the young Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1002, before the would-be couple had a chance to meet. Over the next 26 years, Zoe asked her uncle Basil II for a husband, but her wishes went unheeded. During this time, Zoe's childbearing years came to an end. Her womb went unused rather than serving to incubate a seventh generation of Byzantium's most legendary dynasty. Basil died in 1025, and then her father ruled as sole emperor for a few years. Only when Constantine VIII was on his deathbed did he finally permit Zoe to marry, on the understanding that her husband would serve as the next emperor. From the time of her marriage to Romanus Argyrus until her death in 1050, Zoe would lend her uniquely youthful and beautiful countenance to the state. Unable to bear children and woefully ill-prepared to govern, Zoe nonetheless endeavored to maintain the empire's internal peace by dutifully marrying three men, trying briefly to govern in her own right, and even allowing her youngest sister Theodora to share power. In her old age, Zoe became almost selfless, allowing her final husband, who was a good deal younger, to not only retain his lover, but even to give her official rank and status. Arguably, Zoe established the first recorded polycule, thus anticipating dating trends that are just now becoming accepted as normal some 1,000 years later. While Zoe's record had more blemishes than her well-kept visage, she nonetheless did manage to secure internal peace and prosperity for an entire generation simply by living and allowing the machinery of the imperial state to keep churning along. None of our extant sources from the 11th century bothered to record Zoe's precise date of birth. However, given context clues such as what age she was at different points in time, we can pin down her date of birth to right around 978. She was the second of three daughters born to Constantine VIII and his wife Helena. Unfortunately for Zoe and her sisters, Helena died when they were children, and so they most likely never got to know her very well. Another fact of her childhood is that court life was not terribly lively after a certain point. Her uncle Basil II took on a very severe demeanor and became a kind of warrior monk, vowing to never marry. He also perhaps forced his brother Constantine to also remain celibate and not remarry. So Constantine would have no further children, and Basil would have no children whatsoever. Exactly why Basil chose to do this is not entirely clear, but there's at least a chance that he was extremely jealous of anyone else having power, authority, or prestige. Now, because of this situation being what it was, Zoe, as she's growing up, has every reason to think that one day her uncle will ask her to marry someone and give birth to the next generation of Macedonian ruler, and then using her position as the emperor's mother and the source of the dynasty's legitimacy, she would be one of the most powerful players in the state. And the reason why she would be favored for this role over her sisters is very simple. Zoe was the only one who made a good public face. Zoe was known for her attractiveness, especially in her face. She was remarkably youthful and beautiful, and managed to maintain her beauty with the use of cosmetics all the way until she was in her mid-60s. She also had charm. We don't know exactly how much charm. Certainly she didn't have the magnetism of a Cleopatra, but she was not without charm. She did have friends. She had the ability to be graceful in public. Her sisters, by contrast, didn't have that ability. Her eldest sister was long seen as unfit for public office because she was disfigured at a young age by smallpox, and she was also morbidly religious. Once Eudocia's face was ruined, she decided to withdraw from public life, entered a monastery, and probably died fairly young. As for Zoe's youngest sister, Theodora, Theodora was very intelligent, but she was not attractive. She also had a bit of a goofy, somewhat undistinguished personality. and so Theodora was not necessarily sought after, and she also seems to have taken very little interest in getting married, at least once the prospect became available when she was in her 40s. And so, because of all of this, Zoe was always the princess with the most potential as a bride. She was always the one that visitors to the court would look at and try to arrange marriages with. In 996, Otto III, who was not yet out of his teenage years, came to power in Italy as the Holy Roman Emperor. He quickly took an interest in marrying a Byzantine princess, and he learned that Basil had 3 daughters, all of whom were age appropriate. And so he began to negotiate as soon as he took power. In 1001, the two men agreed that he would in fact marry one of Basil's nieces, and the Archbishop of Milan actually went as his emissary in order to help select a bride for his liege. Arnulf went to Italy, and he selected, unsurprisingly, 23-year-old Zoe as being the best match for what Otto needed. At this time, Otto himself would have been right around 23, so the two may very well have made a good couple. It's also worth mentioning that at home, Zoe would have had very few opportunities to really express herself or do much, given that her uncle Basil II was already overbearing and was becoming increasingly overbearing with time. So this would have been an escape and also an opportunity to really make a name for herself, have a life, see the world, and be a power player. So she left with Arnulf with a sense of adventure, and she sailed all the way to Bari in Italy, but as soon as they landed, they learned that Otto III had died recently, and so there was no longer any reason for Zoe to remain in Italy, so she went home. Over the next quarter century, we know almost nothing about Zoe's life, except that, according to later accounts, she wanted to get married still, and it just never happened. Most likely it didn't happen because Basil didn't want to empower and give a bunch of prestige to whoever married his niece. And so Zoe was a spinstress, seemingly against her will. Her best years passed away, and her opportunity to have children passed away with it. Basil II is almost universally regarded as the greatest emperor Byzantium ever produced, and yet there was one major failing of his time as emperor, and that was a complete and total disregard for the issue of who would come after him. Knowing for a fact that he had no son and no nephew, Basil II nonetheless did nothing. And when his nieces came of age, one option would have been to marry them off and have them have children, but he didn't allow that either, it seems. One possible solution is that his nieces simply weren't interested. After all, our evidence suggests that Eudocia had no interest in ever getting married, and Theodora also seems reluctant, although we don't know whether that was a product of her having reached middle age by the time she was asked, or whether it was something that she never wanted to do whatsoever. When it comes to Zoe, however, she did very much want to get married and have children. She was also interested in having a sex life. She was a fairly normal person in most ways. She wasn't as religious as her oldest sister, who seems to have been someone who really wanted to live the convent life. So most likely, Zoe and her sisters were forbidden to marry because of Basil's paranoia. We have to remember about Basil, he grew up under the shadow of 2 usurpers. And he was also very jealous of his prerogatives. So he feared empowering any nobleman by making him a member of the family. So anyone who married Zoe would necessarily become a member of the dynasty, have influence, and potentially be a threat to Basil's own position, or even just popularity and prestige. Hell, Basil was so jealous that he actually forbade Constantine VIII from attending court at a certain point. So Constantine VIII, out of respect for his brother, / fear of being killed by his brother, wouldn't go to court. Basil was afraid of being upstaged by the taller and better looking Constantine, even though the two of them went through the same traumatic childhood together and emerged as rulers together. By the time that Basil died in 1025, Zoe and all of her sisters were now over 40 years old, and so the solution of having them marry to create new children was no longer viable. So Basil II not only created the crisis, he then failed to solve it and passed it on insoluble to his brother and his nieces. Now, I say it would be impossible now for them to have children because they're over 40. You might point out that today it's common for women over 40 to have children. That's true, but we also live in an age with better nutrition and treatments for fertility. So women in their 40s today can have children fairly regularly. But in the Middle Ages, it was extremely rare. For instance, one of the very few times that we know of when a woman over 40 had a child was when Eleanor of Aquitaine gave birth to the future John Softsword when she was already 42 years old. And that was an accident. It was also extremely unusual, and people doubted that she'd be able to pull it off. But of course she did, although arguably she didn't because John turned out to be a terrible king. But that's a different story for a different time. So again, it looks like Zoe was prevented from getting married and having a normal life because her uncle was paranoid. Whilst in the middle of planning yet another grand campaign, this time in distant Italy, Basil II suddenly fell ill and died in Constantinople right around Christmas time of 1025. His brother Constantine VIII, who had been co-emperor technically for about half a century, was now able to slide right into the role of sole emperor, and for the most part things proceeded smoothly. All of Basil's appointments continued on, and aside from the cancellation of the Italian campaign, everything continued forward. Constantine was notably less active than Basil because he suffered from gout, and he certainly did not have Basil's restless energy or desire to go gain everlasting glory by fighting endless wars. However, while Constantine was generally a competent administrator and was generally respected by the people in government, there was one issue that he was unwilling to discuss, and it was arguably the only issue that really mattered: the succession. Perhaps Constantine merely feared his own mortality. Perhaps he wanted to better enjoy his short period of time on the throne without his brother's overbearing presence. Or perhaps he felt like he was complicit in creating the crisis and didn't want to have to face reality yet. So perhaps Constantine agreed that his daughters shouldn't be married, or perhaps he was the one who prevented them from getting married. We don't know. My suspicion is that it was Basil, but again, we don't know. So only when it became clear that he was not going to recover from his latest illness did Constantine finally get serious about finding a husband for Zoe who would go on to be the next ruler. It appears that being a kind and loving father, that Constantine also was interested in Zoe's preferences. Zoe famously loved handsome men, and so he chose one of the most handsome senior officials in Byzantium, Constantine Dalasinos, to be his new son-in-law and successor. However, Constantine Dalasinos was not nearby, and he wouldn't be able to arrive in time, so officials around Constantine convinced him that instead he should see his daughter marry Romanus Argyrus, who was the next best candidate, and he happened to be present. And so Constantine the emperor forced Romanus to divorce his wife and marry his daughter. The choice of Romanus is a bit peculiar since Romanus was about the same age as Constantine VIII, and also Romanus was not necessarily someone who had obvious qualifications to be emperor the way that Constantine Dalasinos did, but it looks like he was the choice of the people at court precisely because he was not likely to be a very active, overbearing, or particularly difficult taskmaster. And so, Zoe was now finally married, and her father even got to witness it while on his deathbed. Very shortly after witnessing his daughter's marriage, Constantine VIII passed away in 1028. The new couple of Zoe and Romanus was nothing if not ambitious. The two of them decided upon getting married that they were going to defy the odds and have a child. So what if Zoe was past her childbearing years? With the blessing of God and a little bit of help from every quack in Constantinople, they were going to make this thing happen. Zoe at this time also seems to have had a rather strong sex drive if our sources are to be believed, because she had had to hold it back for so many years, and now nearing the age of 50, she finally had the opportunity to experience sex for the first time. And so she and Romanus were trying their damnedest to have a child, and despite all the massages and stones and everything else that they could find, they were unable to achieve pregnancy. And eventually they'll kind of give up on each other. In Romanus's case, partly it's because he now reached an age where he was beyond his interest in sex. So Romanus would at first take other lovers, and then he would kind of just slow down sexually. At the same time, though, Zoe had found a new lover that she liked far better than Romanus. He was in his early 20s. He could keep up with her and perhaps wear her out. This is young Michael the Paphlagonian, later Michael IV, a young and extremely attractive man. Michael was the younger brother of Romanus's senior administrator, John the Orphanotrophos. And Michael also had a bevy of health issues. So most likely, even if Romanus was aware of him, he didn't take him super seriously. Our sources debate whether Romanus was really aware of Zoe's affairs, and it looks pretty likely that she was. She allowed Romanus to do his thing if she could do hers, and he had no real way to complain, because again, his source of legitimacy, the only reason why he mattered, was that he was married to Zoe. So if Zoe were to drop him, he would just be another guy. However, my suspicion is that Romanus was aware of Michael and had a kind of way to hip check him. So famously, Romanus, as he was getting older and stiffer, would force Michael to rub his feet. So when they were in the bedroom together, he'd summon Michael and have him rub his feet. And this is a way to tell him, you're not as valuable as your older brother who runs the state for me. And you're also not the emperor. I am. The only thing you are is the empress's animate dildo. Keep that in mind. Go about your business, young man. I'm going to take a nap. Romanus ends up dying under rather suspicious circumstances. He was swimming in the pool under the palace, and then he had a medical episode, and he died. He had also been experiencing a lot of swelling in the last couple of years, so there was widespread speculation that Zoe had poisoned him. And that may be the case. However, we also have to remember that he was over 70 years old in a time when people could die rather suddenly of illnesses that they couldn't quite diagnose or cure. And his health had been in the shitter for a few years now. So it wasn't necessarily that exceptionally odd, except that Zoe moved very quickly to marry Michael and make that legitimate. That's the only thing that's really suspicious and makes me think that maybe Zoe was willing to get rid of Romanus to empower her new lover. We'll never know, but there's at least I would say, 50-50 chance that Zoe was a murderer. And really, if we're talking about the blemishes on her record, assuming that this is the case, this is by far the worst thing she ever did. At Romanus's funeral, Michael appeared beside Zoe, and Zoe proudly presented him as her new husband and the next emperor. Therefore, Romanus's funeral was really more about Michael than it was about Romanus. By the time Romanus died, he wasn't that popular, and most people really didn't care that there were rumors he might have been murdered. They also thought that all would be well. They largely supported Zoe, so the common people seemed to have had a great love for her. And also, we have to remember that the state had been managed by John the Orphanotrophos for a few years now, and he had had a chance to put mostly loyalists in positions of power, meaning that there was no real opposition to Michael's rise. Most of the officials assumed that John would continue to run things and that Michael would do a decent enough job as a kind of cipher. However, Michael, while he would work hand in glove with John, was certainly not a weakling, and he would assert himself. Not long after they were married, Michael confined Zoe to the women's quarter and began to rule without consulting her. Now, exactly why he chose to put her away is unclear. It could be that he did not reciprocate her feelings. It could be as simple as that. It could also be, as some have suggested, that he was disgusted by how she had murdered Romanus. We'll never know. All we know for sure is that he no longer allowed her to appear in public. So for the next several years, from 1034 to 1041, Zoe was largely isolated. She also, being a proud woman, did not reach out or try to stir up trouble in order to get herself out of this fix. Perhaps, even at this date, she had learned to put the state's interest ahead of her own. And so, while Michael ignored her, she continued to live her life in silence. It appears that Zoe was also not the kind of person to keep grudges, as we'll see with how she deals with Michael IV and his nephew Michael V. Despite what had gone down, she remained very fond of Michael, and she was deeply affected when she learned that he had fallen mortally ill and was on his deathbed. So she asked to see him, and he refused. And there are a number of possible reasons. One is that he was simply ashamed at how he had treated her, and the other is that because she had fallen in love with him for his dashing good looks, he didn't want her to see him as a bloated, broken down shell of himself. He had developed some sort of horrible disease, and this had really marred his looks. So one of those two explanations seems to be the case. And given Zoe's emphasis on looks, both her own and those of others, it's a pretty good chance it's actually the latter explanation rather than Michael feeling bad for having cast her aside. Back when Michael IV and Zoe were still living together, before he decided to put her aside and become a serious emperor, he had taken the important step of adopting his nephew, also named Michael, as his son and heir. And this is significant because now Michael V, who has no blood relation to Zoe and will not marry her, has a claim to the Macedonian mantle without being a member of the family. So adoption is the next best thing to having an actual child. All the men Zoe had married up to this point were childless, including Michael IV. And now that he was married to Zoe, he couldn't have any legitimate offspring. So adopting Michael's nephew was a great step. And this also makes sense because Michael IV was unlikely to live long enough to see Zoe die and then to go on to marry another woman and have a child that way. So this was the best possible solution, and it shows once again that John the Orphanatrophos was at least a borderline political genius. So Zoe, as soon as Michael IV was dead, she came out of her seclusion in the women's quarters, and she decided to do her utmost to get Michael V over with the people. And when they saw her touring around with her son Michael, everyone cheered. And it wasn't because they were enthusiastic at seeing a new emperor, they had liked Michael IV pretty well, but rather that they were excited to see Zoe. They hadn't seen her in several years, ever since she was secluded by Michael IV. And they found that she was still youthful and beautiful. And this heartened them because it meant that she was healthy, that she would continue to live. And if she continues to live and to thrive, then perhaps that means that the Macedonian twilight will continue, that this dynasty that's brought such prosperity to the land will continue on longer than anyone thinks possible, that the dream isn't dead. Well, that would be how a normal person might interpret it, but Michael V was young and experienced and extremely arrogant, so he thought that all the cheers were for him, and he thought that this was a mandate for him to do whatever he needed to do, or whatever he thought he needed to do. And so Michael V, the Caulker, Caliphates, he will go on to break his promises. So when he became emperor, it was under a series of promises. First and foremost, he had to promise to obey his uncle John. John had spent a long time setting up the government of the Paphlagonian Dynasty. He had put a lot of people into place, he was running the state, and he had really kept the empire together, in addition to empowering his own family. At the same time, the public wanted to make sure that Michael would obey his mother Zoe. They wanted to make sure that the two of them would get along and that Zoe would have a strong influence. And so publicly he pledged his support for Zoe, and people applauded that because they loved Zoe. But a few months into his reign, he decided that it was time for him to do his own thing. First, he struck at his own family. He had John the Orphanatrophos and most of his uncles removed from power. He even had a couple of them castrated. The next move was against Zoe, and this is actually the bolder move. Now, while the Paphlagonian dynasty was much more important for governance, Zoe was his source of legitimacy, and she was the one the people loved. So when he decided to ship her off to a monastery on Principus Island on the charge that she was in fact a regicide, this didn't settle well with the people. And when his officials announced that this action had been taken and why it had been taken, almost spontaneously a massive riot broke out and people demanded that Zoe be restored. Michael's own bodyguards were quickly overwhelmed, and things got out of control. And now Zoe, for the first time in her life, would be center stage in front of the people, faced with a choice, and basically being the person who had the power to make the situation go one way or the other. So we'll see, how does Zoe do at crowd control? The crowd outside of Michael's palace grew and became more strident. They demanded that Zoe be restored. And so Michael V lost his nerve and did just that. He had Zoe recalled, and when she arrived at the palace before she was presented to the people to prove that she was alive and unharmed, she agreed, apparently, that she would denounce any form of violence. Now, our sources say that she was intimidated by Michael and that he effectively bullied her, and that she was kind of a foolish old woman who was easily misled and easily intimidated. It's also possible, if we think about it, that this is just a reflection of her class consciousness. She is, of course, a member of the royal family, and as such is probably deeply distrustful of crowds. And so, even though she may have had some personal misgivings about Michael and his uncle, the surviving one, I believe, is named Constantine, she still trusted them more than she trusted a crowd that could easily be incited and act emotionally. So Zoe did her best to calm the crowd and to try to play down any calls for violence against Michael, saying that she didn't like violence. But the crowd was still very eager to remove Michael from office and blind him. The situation will become a little bit more complicated when a second mob appears. And this mob is headed by people demanding that Theodora, Zoe's younger sister, be installed as empress instead. So you have one crowd chanting for Zoe, one for Theodora, and this was a little window in time when the pathetic, sniveling Michael V and his uncle were able to have a little bit of a reprieve. But eventually, Zoe will show her political skill, knowing, as she does, that her political stock has been damaged by her two previous marriages and also by what happened with her stepson. She decides that she needs to glom herself onto Theodora. So what she does is she walks up to Theodora and inside of the crowd hugs her and then invites her to come live in the palace. And Theodora agrees. So that satisfies both groups because both of their preferred sisters are now on the same side. So that's great for them and it works out. Zoe will retain both her influence in general and also her primacy over her sister, as we'll see. As for Michael V and his uncle, well, despite Zoe's apparently rather tepid protest, he was still stripped of his office, blinded, and sent into exile where he died pretty soon thereafter. One has to imagine that despite her protest and despite her feminine dislike of violence, that Zoe actually was not very sad to see Michael see for the last time. This set the stage for a period of time in which the two sisters co-ruled the empire. We know the precise dates of this period. It is from April 21st to June 11th of 1042. During this time, the two would sit in state and receive audiences. They would also attend meetings of the various ministers. Zoe at this time had precedence, and she saw to this by the fact that she had her chair pushed slightly forward, and also she did more talking than Theodora. So Zoe was kind of like the chairwoman, and Theodora would only chime in on occasion. Apparently Theodora had a bit of a tendency to say things that were mildly annoying, but also Theodora was probably the more intelligent of the two, and she sometimes could be quite insightful. That being said, Zoe, while she didn't necessarily have any glistening insights, was still able to more or less direct things. During their time as co-rulers, when they were the ones making the final decisions, the two sisters made two very important decisions. One is that George Maniakes, the famous giant general, was sent back to Italy, where he had done so much good in the past. This would be important going forward as well. They also decided to stop the corrupt practice that had persisted under the Paphlagonians of selling offices. So this was a measure of good government. However, beyond that, because of the brevity of their reign, they actually don't really do all that much. And the reason why this period ends is because Skylitzes tells us that Zoe grew a little weary of governing. We don't know what Theodora thought about it, and her later actions show that perhaps Theodora actually enjoyed this and wanted to keep doing it. But we also know that there was a bit of mounting tension between them, and that members of the Senate were trying to set them against each other. So perhaps Zoe wanted to head that off at the pass by creating a situation where there would be no reason to try to create tension between herself and Theodora. It seems like she probably liked being reconciled with her only living relative. That seems to be something that may have been dear to Zoe's heart, although we can't really know that. And so what they decided was to heed the advice of the men around them, who said that one of them needs to get married in order to take a husband and let the husband run the state. Zoe, once again, as we'll see, was the person who was going to step up and get married. Had Theodora been so inclined, she probably could have insisted that it was her turn to take a husband and select the next ruler of Byzantium, but she decided that she had no interest in ever being married, and so she deferred to her older sister. Zoe, for her part, at age 64, was still eager to have a little bit of romance in her life, and so she was glad enough to take her chance and find a third husband. This would also be her last legal marriage under canon law, by the way. So if this marriage were to fall apart for whatever reason, Zoe would no longer be able to marry anyone else. At this age, Zoe was still attractive, so even though she was now in her mid-60s, Zoe was still able to conceal her age through the use of cosmetics, and she would retain that ability for a few more years before age finally caught up to her. She still retained a very strong interest in handsome men, and if we think about it, there's actually a fairly good reason why this is the case, aside from her personal preferences. So if we think about what Zoe can offer to the public, she offers a youthful, vigorous-looking face that shows that she still has vigor, that she will still be alive years down the line. And so that gives people hope for the future and for the continuity of the Macedonian Dynasty. And so Zoe seems to be conscious of that, and perhaps it's that, in addition to vanity, that really drove her to work so hard to hide her age through cosmetics. So if she wants to really reinforce that effect of her being a beautiful, vigorous woman still in her prime, then having a suitably handsome husband is actually a pretty big asset. So there's perhaps a chance that this is a way in which she actually is politically savvy. Although, of course, it's possible she just likes guys who she thinks are hot. Anyway, she held what amounts to a groom show. So earlier in Byzantine history, there had been bride shows where young emperors would have beautiful women from around the empire brought to him, and he would kind of do a little dating game where he would choose one of them. So she kind of does the same thing, where she'll arrange interviews where different men will meet with her. Many of these men are currently married, but she's already established the precedent back with Romanus Argyrus that she can force people to get divorced and then marry her. Or I should say, back then, it was her father who did the forcing, but now, of course, it will be Zoe herself. Her first choice was the man who was going to become her husband back in 1028, and would have had he been just a little bit closer to the capital. Constantine Dalasinos had an interview with Zoe, but it went badly because he came across as arrogant. Translation: he wanted to be emperor and institute fairly sweeping reforms. He wanted to govern in his own right and govern as a strong emperor with his own program. This horrified Zoe's advisors, and they dissuaded her from going with Dalasinos. Her next candidate was someone she knew from the past, Constantine Atroclines, and there were widespread rumors that the two of them had been lovers at one point. So this would have been a fairly amicable union, since the two of them already were quite familiar. However, that would have required him to divorce his wife, who apparently loved him very much. And before this could happen, when it was pretty clear that Zoe was leaning his direction, he suddenly up and died. That led to widespread speculation that his wife had poisoned him in order to prevent him from running off with Zoe. We'll never know, of course, whether she did it or not, and as an older gentleman, Constantine Atroclines simply could have had a medical incident that was perfectly legitimate. We'll never know. Eventually, the person she found was a widower, so she would not have to worry about him being poisoned by a jealous spouse. His name was Constantine Monomachus, and he would be her third and final husband. And he would become emperor as Constantine IX. With her first two marriages, the actual ceremony went off without a hitch, but when it came time for her third marriage, Zoe ran afoul of the patriarch Alexius. Now, while it had long been established that a third marriage was completely acceptable, Patriarch Alexius apparently disagreed with that aspect of his own church doctrine. And because both Zoe and Constantine were going to be married for the third time, he refused to preside over the ceremony, which meant that they had to turn to a lesser bishop in order to get things done. But despite that initial rough start, things would eventually proceed relatively smoothly, at least at home. Zoe seems to have had an appreciation for Constantine's good looks, but there was quite an age gap between them. She was already in her mid-60s, and he was perhaps in his early to mid-40s. So while they seem to have had some respect for one another, they don't appear to have really had much of a sexual relationship. And perhaps Zoe noticed that her new husband was pining for someone who had been his previous lover. And now what she'll do shows that she has quite a bit of creativity and that she was rather open-minded. We'll get into that in a minute. We also have to remember that Zoe at this point had figured out that governing in her own right was not for her. There might be other people who were capable of doing it, but certainly it wasn't her. Perhaps because of her advancing age, she wanted to retire, as we would think of it. She wanted to go back to having a more leisured life to pursue her hobbies. And so this marriage was in many ways a matter of convenience anyway. It was for the good of the state. She had done her duty. She had kept things going for another generation. And so why not kick back and relax? And if you're going to do that, then why take things too seriously? So she came up with a solution for the problem of having a husband who seemed mopey and needed to be on his best so that he could govern the empire. And that solution was what appears to be polyamory. Early in her marriage to Constantine IX, Zoe learned that her husband was still very much pining for his longtime mistress Maria Sclerina. At this time, Maria was still living on the island where he had left her when he had come to Constantinople for his interview. Zoe surprised Maria by writing her a letter, inviting her to Constantinople and pledging that they could get along and be friends. When Maria arrived, she was even more surprised when Zoe, apparently it was Zoe's idea, offered to give her an official title and place at court, so she would take the new title of Sebaste, which effectively means something like Junior Empress. So this was pretty unprecedented. This is not something that anyone had ever tried before. And to be fair, no one had ever been in Zoe's situation before. No one had been an elderly empress who was using marriage as a kind of conduit for someone else to take the reins legally without causing a disruption to the peace. In order to keep all of the various empresses happy, Constantine IX was extremely generous with his treasury, and he allowed Theodora, Zoe, and Maria to maintain their own courts and effectively do what they wanted. So while this was expensive, it did solve the problem of keeping the two women who were responsible for putting him in power happy, and it also made sure that his lover Maria was satisfied. So this was actually not a bad arrangement for the time, given that the Byzantine treasury was doing well, and that they were able to afford all of this. It also would have been a great time, as Pacellus indicates, to have been a courtier. So if you wanted an imperial patron, this would have been a great time. You've got 4 of them available. So, while this was a good time for most of the people at court, Pacellus worried that perhaps it was during this time that the treasury was depleted, when all of the hard-won gains made under, say, Basil II were expended on frivolous things. And he also believed that the beginning of the decline that would really become evident at the Battle of Manzikert began right here at Constantine's court, with the sort of polygamous arrangement that Constantine IX and Zoe set up. That being said, it's still pretty interesting that Zoe came up with this solution, because it isn't really in her character as established so far, to do something like this. So perhaps with age came a certain amount of wisdom and resignation. Or perhaps she genuinely liked Constantine as a person enough that she wanted to make sure that he was happy. We'll never know exactly what her motives were, but certainly this was a fairly novel solution to an equally novel problem. And it shows that while Zoe was far from a kind of governmental genius, she did have some abilities when it came to problem solving and thinking outside the box. After 1042, Zoe's public appearances became fewer and fewer. She seems to have largely withdrawn from the public spotlight as much as possible. She and Theodora would still appear at public ceremonies, and they would take precedence over Maria Sclarina by walking in front of her. However, for whatever reason, rumors began to spread that Maria was planning to kill the two sisters and be rid of them. And when those rumors got out, the public was outraged and a massive riot took place. So another crowd walked to the palace and demanded that justice be served for the deaths of the Macedonian sisters. The only problem, of course, is that both of them were still alive and well. So Zoe and Theodora appeared on the balcony and addressed the crowd. They assured them that nothing was happening and that they were on good terms with Maria Sclarina, that all was well, and the crowd agreed to go home. So, among other things, this shows that the crowd's sympathies remained with the two sisters and not with the people they had brought into their lives to help govern the empire. Another thing that it shows is perhaps this conspiracy theory might have been based on some impressions that people had that then developed into rumors. So, for instance, we learn from our sources that it was around this time after her marriage to Constantine that her efforts to conceal her age finally failed, when Father Time finally caught up with her. This also may have been related to her failing health as well, because she will only live until 1050, and so it's not unreasonable to speculate that by about 1045 or so, she was beginning to experience health issues. So either someone had talked to someone who had familiarity with her health issues, or perhaps someone had seen her from a distance without her makeup and noticed that she looked a lot older, and so they had assumed that this must be due to foul play rather than to the ravages of nature. But we'll never know exactly how those rumors got started. What is clear, though, is that the Macedonian sisters once again proved to be capable of getting a crowd to stand down. And so Zoe's final appearance was a little anticlimactic. Ironically enough, given the fears that the crowd had for the health of Zoe and Theodora, the first person in the polycule to die was the youngest member, Maria Sclarina. She died suddenly in 1046, and with her passing, Constantine IX entered into a period of intense grief. At her funeral, he wept uncontrollably, and that in itself was a mild scandal. After all, officially, Zoe was his wife. As for Zoe's own death, we actually know extremely little about it. So despite her significance, despite being one of the major players in the second quarter of the 11th century, Zoe's own death was very quiet. She didn't so much die as fade away around 1050. And our sources don't really tell us anything about the funeral, the cause of death, or anything else. So, with our sources being so silent about her death, scholars have had to speculate about the significance of it. After all, for a figure as major as Zoe to pass, there must have been some consequence. So one proposal that some scholars have made is that the regime of the philosophers, a group of people at court who had ideas about government, led by a future patriarch named Constantine Lycides, that their time of prominence came to an end because of Zoe's death. We certainly know it was around the same time that their prominence came to an end. We don't know exactly if Zoe's death had anything to do with it. But the reason that is given as a matter of speculation is that Zoe may have been his patron. Again, though, this is all speculation. We actually don't know. We don't know if she was even interested in this person or his activities. But it does seem possible that perhaps it was Zoe's death that spelled doom for this court faction. We'll never know, though, because again, Zoe faded out, and we were left with just one Macedonian sister and one emperor who was now a widower once again. Despite having had very limited influence on actual policy during her time, Zoe Porphyrogenita remains one of the most significant figures in Byzantium during the 11th century. Her willingness to marry 3 times helped to prolong the Macedonian dynasty for about 30 years after her father's death. So her ability to get married and to kind of play empress was significant because it kept Byzantium at peace and out of civil war for about 30 years. She also was blessed with great beauty, and she was able to use that to great political effect. She understood that by having an unusually youthful appearance, that she could help to symbolize a kind of enduring vigor for the Macedonian dynasty. So while anyone could figure out that the dynasty was dying because its only heirs were 2 aging women who were past their childbearing time, she still, by appearing youthful, could give them the illusion that maybe there was a future under the Macedonians, and maybe she actually would live far, far longer than anyone thought plausible. So she managed to take her own vanity and her love of cosmetics and make it into a useful political tool, which shows that she does have quite a bit of creativity. Zoe was also wildly popular with the people, so the people rioted for her on a couple of different occasions. And she was also fairly good at talking to the people in a way that made her seem likable, and also that helped calm people down. She also was able to get along with most of the members of the elite. While she doesn't seem to have been wildly charismatic, she was relatively charming and not that hard to get along with. She wasn't as awkward as her sister Theodora. She also wasn't abrasive like Constantine VIII. So she was someone with a pretty good temperament and someone who could inspire just enough loyalty and just enough good feeling to keep things on track. That being said, despite having some good qualities, Zoe did have some downsides. For instance, she had no real training in government. She probably didn't really understand how things worked. In fact, our sources say that she was a bit out of her depth when she was being briefed, that she kind of understood the broad strokes, but not well enough to actually govern. She also didn't have any natural talent that she could have developed for that. So this was, frankly, above her, or beyond her. That being said, Zoe was someone who did have the self-awareness to realize that about herself. She knew that she didn't have the attention span or the work ethic to be an empress. And so what she did instead was make sure that she did the best that she could do. And she tried to figure out what was the best for the state as a whole. And so that's largely how she lived her life. And despite being someone who loved pleasure and was obsessed with handsome men, I would even call Zoe mostly responsible, because she took her power and her responsibilities seriously. And she made sure that she did what she thought was best. Now, we could critique her choice of husbands. None of the people she chose were particularly good at what they did. But we have to remember, this is someone who doesn't really understand government. So she might not have understood why the choices that she made in terms of husbands were not ideally suited to be rulers. She also, of course, bungled the Michael V situation. But that being said, I feel like a lot of people are a little too harsh on Zoe when they effectively label her as a foolish old woman, or they look at her as being overly naive or incompetent. I think that she's really more in the middle, that she has a lot of good qualities and then some major failings that are fewer but perhaps just as important overall. So that's all I have on Zoe Porphyrogenita. She's one of the more interesting people of this time, and I'm glad that I took the time to talk about her. I hope you enjoyed it as well. So next time we'll take a look at her final husband, Constantine IX, and then we'll take a look at Zoe's youngest sister, Theodora, or as I like to think of her, the first B. Arthur.